In 3, 2, 1. This is Acting Mastery. I'm Ben Matthews. Welcome to the Acting Mastery podcast. I'm Ben Matthews. Today we're thrilled to have Scott Williams, founder of the Impulse Company International and one of London's leading Meisner Technique teachers. Scott trained with Sanford Meisner himself at the Neighbourhood Playhouse in New York and with the renowned director William Ball at the American Conservatory Theatre. Scott has been teaching and directing all around the world for over 40 years, and in this episode we explore what Meisner training offers and what it means to live truthfully, moment to moment, in a state of aliveness. Scott Williams, welcome to Acting Mastery.
Thanks, Ben.
So nice to see you.
Great to be here.
Scott, I thought we might begin by getting you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about how you began your journey as an actor and what led you into teaching.
Oh, I always knew I wanted to teach. When I was 15, I started teaching and just did because I was crazy and did it. And that was always the direction I wanted to go. Directing and teaching were the two things that caught my eye. So it's a little slightly odd that I ended up in Meisner's classroom, famous acting teacher, although at that time known as American theater's best kept secret. But I ended up there and thought, and I went there to Neighbourhood Playhouse to study with Meisner, specifically because I wanted to be a director who knew how to talk to actors and a teacher who had something in his back pocket. I didn't predict when I got there the impact it would have on my life. That has been a lovely kind of blossoming discovery over the years, is how important it was, because I was 19 when I started working with Meisner. So it's a fair few years ago.
And how long did you train under Meisner?
For a year.
For a year.
Yeah, at Playhouse, yeah.
He was one of the two big influences on your approach. The other was William Ball. Tell us, especially for people who may not be familiar with William Ball, tell us a bit about him.
Yeah, Ben, I feel sometimes like I want to keep the flame alive about Bill Ball because he had a massive impact on me and on thousands of people. But I think increasingly we don't know who he is. William Ball was considered in the late 80s, well, I'll start that one again, late 50s and early 60s as the hot rising young director on the Broadway scene and off-Broadway scene. And he did a couple of shows in New York that got a lot of attention. And he began to kind of climb the ladder and make big noise. And he got hired by Elia Kazan, who was obviously the great director of that era. And Kazan hired him because Kazan was running a new theater called the Lincoln Center Theater, still exists in New York. And Kazan hired Bill to direct the opening show of, I think, his second season at Lincoln Center. The show was Tartuffe. And Bill went in, probably Bill was maybe just a little over 30 at this point, and started directing. And while he was in the rehearsals, the board of directors fired the entire senior management, including Kazan, from the organization. And Bill found that so destabilizing that business people could have that level of control over the life of the artist. And he found it so upsetting and so counter to what he believed artists need to work well, that he vowed to leave the theater. He made a decision he couldn't work under those conditions. And he wrote an exit document, which was basically a manifesto that described what he thought theater should be and how it should be run, how it should be structured, et cetera, et cetera. It was a grand vision. And he wrote that, and that paper fell into the hands of a guy named McNeil Lowry, who was a great funder. And Lowry worked for, I think, the Ford Foundation, and he believed in Bill's vision so strongly that he wrote a massive check at the time. I think it was 300,000 US dollars to start Bill's vision. And that began Bill's grand vision, which was called American Conservatory Theatre, the linking of a full-time training organization to a full-time repertory company, in which the members of the repertory company trained their successors to come up and replace them through the system, and the support for the artist that implied. So that was Bill's big vision. And that I stepped into. Bill ended up in San Francisco, where ACT still exists. And I was 14, 15 years old, and found my way to ACT and thought, this is what I think theater should be, not knowing that it almost never was, and to my knowledge really hasn't existed since then in the grand vision of Bill. So I carried that vision forward, thinking that's what I agreed, that's what theater should be, a nurturing place for the artist to produce their best work. And then I went to Neighbourhood Playhouse when I was 19. And the culture shock was massive, because Bill was this extraordinary creative person, and created this energy that he called positation, a word he made up, but that expressed his view that we say yes to every idea. We treat one another with respect. Bill was had his own demons and peccadillos, but he was an inspiring man to be in the room with. So I thought that's what theater was. Then I went to New York, worked with Meisner at Neighborhood Playhouse, and discovered that it's not all that. And Meisner, for all his brilliance, and there was absolute brilliance in the man, did not create anything like the same atmosphere that Bill had created. And I realized then, and now ever since, have been trying to put together those two concepts under one vision. Bill's approaches and ideas about the creator and the artist, and Meisner's rock solid techniques to train actors and writers and directors. And so that's what the Impulse Company is the marriage of those two ideas.
How would you describe that difference in approach between Meisner and Ball?
So Meisner is famous for, as so many of his colleagues were at the time, the Lee Strasbergs, the Stella Adlers, the Elia Kazans, all those people who started in the group theater together and went out and took the great word of Stanislavski forward in various ways in various places. Meisner was exacting and demanding. And in today's era, I can't conceive that he would have been allowed to teach the way he taught, with the kind of underlying rage and judgment and tension that was in the room. So there was this huge engine going on at Neighborhood Playhouse. We all went for Meisner, but and everybody who worked there was sort of under his spell, shall we say. But I really reacted against that. I thought that negative energy didn't jibe with the thing I'd learned from Bill, which was that the artist deserves protecting and deserves nurture and deserves encouragement. And so Meisner was not an encouraging man; he was a demanding man. And a lot of people who either were in the room with Meisner, as I was, although we're getting thin on the ground, like thin on our hair. Those people who see him on videotape or hear stories about him assume that his ferocity, and he was ferocious, is one of the reasons he was a great teacher. And I just never took that point of view. I think he had brilliant gifts as a teacher, two specifically. One was that he was incredibly specific and didn't waste a word in giving you his point of view. I actually was contacted recently by an academic who was writing a paper on Meisner's use of metaphor as a teacher. And he was brilliant at it. When you say to an actor something as pithy as the text is like a canoe, it floats on the river, the good things that emerge from that specificity are incalculable in the actor. Or when he described the acting process as the pinch and the ouch. These metaphors are incredibly powerful for actors. And Meisner was so gifted at that, and gifted also at giving the actor a sequential approach, a sequential technical approach. This thing, we do this, and then we do that, following on that, which leads to the next stage, which is also a rare thing for a teacher to know. Those two gifts meant he was a particularly brilliant teacher, but he didn't create much of a warm environment in which to do those things. And I just never felt, as some people I know do, that Meisner's ferocity was why he was great. And so they duplicate the ferocity, thinking that'll help. It doesn't help, in my view. The actor is it's a contradictory thing. You know this, Ben, better than anybody. It's a contradictory thing to be an actor. You have to have skin as tough as leather and be vulnerable at the same time. And it's a big ask that we put on to actors, is that you got to have both of those things. And I don't think, frankly, it's either fair or just that we do that. But I think we can protect you. We can give you a nurturing home, but make high standards and demands on your artistic visions. Does that answer the question about Bill's approach versus, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like it was very lucky that you studied in that order with
100%.
First. Yeah.
100%.
What were the key lessons that you took away from working with Meisner? Obviously, one of the big approaches in your work is Meisner repetition. What was it that you loved about the Meisner approach?
So I'm going to slightly transmute your question into what makes Meisner different from other method-based, Stanislavski-based approaches, psychological realism as a teacher.
Yes, that was a question I had anyway. So please do. Well, if you want to speak to the difference between Meisner and Adler and Strasberg, that would be amazing.
It's an easy one, both technically in terms of what he taught and also the way he taught. We've already talked about the manner with which he taught, but if you ask me to define what made Meisner a different teacher than Strasberg or Stella Adler or the other people who also learned alongside him at the group theater, I can tell you in one phrase. For Meisner, what happens to you as an actor does not depend on you. It depends on what the other person does to you. If you look at Lee Strasberg's basic idea, the idea of sense memory, what he called affective memory, and you look at that as an approach, and then you look at Meisner's approach, which has nothing to do with one's personal memories, but everything to do with the fact that the other person is having an impact on them, then you realize we're actually 180 degrees different. We started from the same place, but we've come to utterly different conclusions from that. And I find the connection that happens between two actors more stimulating and interesting and rich than any memory an actor brings into the room or into the work. For Stella Adler, in her case, she disagreed with Strasberg. She said it's not about your memories. It's about what she called the imaginative force, the use of the imagination. Well, that to me sits in the same general area as memory, because both of those things take place in the actor's head. And Meisner said, famously, don't be in your head. Put your attention on your partner. The pinch and the ouch is there for you to respond to. And let's see where that can take you. A great deal of my work, Ben, huge, as you know from having worked with me, a huge amount of my work is proving to the actor that concept is enough to get them where they want to go.
Absolutely. Could you maybe just explain for those who may not be familiar with those two concepts that you spoke about earlier, the pinch and the ouch, what that means, and also the metaphor that Meisner used that you spoke of in terms of the text floating on top of the river, like a canoe?
And again, I'm going to combine this question with another thing that you and I have talked about in many of our very stimulating chats, which is that I think a lot of people talk about Meisner's concepts and mix them with other things. They bring in a little of, to pull a name out of the hat, Lecoq, and they do physical theater alongside Meisner's work. Or there's any number of approaches that are Meisner adjacent, we'll call them. Yeah. Having been in the room with Meisner and seeing the rigor with which he taught, I think that's one of my huge takeaways from that experience. So, for example, the repetition exercise, a very basic foundational exercise in that Meisner taught, exists to codify what are the first two words of his definition for acting. Meisner's definition for acting begins with the concept of living truthfully. I mean, put those two words side by side and something starts to vibrate already in the actor. Living truthfully. Note that he doesn't say living believably. He doesn't, believable happens in the audience. The actor has no control over that. But living truthfully is such a rich and already present idea. And so we go through a series of stages in the training of the actor in repetition, very specific. One thing has a particular attachment, and then we add something new to it and develop the actor, all toward the idea of what does it mean to really live truthfully. Again, embodying this concept of what the other person does to you impacts on what you're doing, your impulsive response, hence the name of my company, the Impulse Company.
Yeah.
So, for example, a repetition exercise is taught all over the world now. Meisner has become a kind of lingua franca for the training of actors, and that's been marvelous and exciting to see. What my understanding is that typically people begin by making a comment on the other person, and then the other person repeats it from their point of view. So I might say, you have headphones, and you would say, I have
headphones. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And that idea already skips a beat, because Meisner's first idea, before we get to you and I, his first idea is let's take text out of this equation for just a while and put it up on top. We'll let the text float on top like that canoe in the river. And we will do something else. We won't be dealing with text. We'll instead be dealing with what the other person does, not what they say. And suddenly, text will take on the quality. That's why the metaphor is so perfect. Text takes on the quality of what's happening underneath, just as the canoe does the river, takes on the quality of the river. And so I think it's important to do every stage of the work because every stage matters equally in the development of the concept of living truthfully.
I think I've heard you say before that repetition is more than simply an exercise. What is it for those who may not be familiar with repetition or what it can offer? How would you define it as a tool for actors, and why do you think it is so powerful as a training method?
Meisner had a sign on his desk in his office, which was a translation from Goethe, the German playwright and philosopher. And what it said in English was, would that the stage is as high and as narrow as a tightrope so that only the trained would dare walk across it. So his point of view is that the actor, like the pianist, like the dancer at the bar, requires exercise, specific targeted exercise to develop the muscles that they use when they act. So repetition is a lot more than just a conceptual thing. It's an actual muscle development exercise, working on the muscles for living truthfully, which we codify as putting your attention on your partner and responding to what they give you. Observing and responding in 50-50 measures. So that's the purpose of that. And that's why we do it, I won't say endlessly, but we do it a lot. Meisner's own construct that he used to say was, it takes 20 years to become an actor. I'm not sure if I agree with the date, but I agree with the concept that underlies it. That an actor like a pianist playing that thing back there would have to take, I wouldn't expect to sit down and play Rachmaninoff in my second week. I'd need a lot of development to do so. Why would acting be any different?
And so the main, one of the main strengths of the repetition exercise is that it gets the attention off of yourself and onto the other. Why do you think for you is that a more useful and powerful way of approaching acting than going in and, as you were saying with Strasberg, using your own memory or your own life, and with Adler using the imagination?
Right. It seems to me, as a director and as a teacher, that the most important unit for the actor to consider is the moment. More important than the character arc, more important than the journey, more important than the beat or unit. The moment is the key focal point for the actor. And that is because if you think about great performances you've seen, you're remembering moments. You're remembering the thing that happened when that actor did that thing in response to that moment. Opposite, whatever it is, whether it's in film, whether it's live in theater, you remember moments. And the actor's job, it seems to me, is the moment. It is not the character's journey. That is the writer's job. It's somebody else's job to craft that. And if the actor is thinking about the journey, they're not living in the moment. And so all of our work and all of our effort is about bringing the actor into, and I'll use the other concept, the present. Live in the present moment. And there's so much pressing on the actor that takes the actor away from the present. Think about the first time you sit down and somebody puts a script in your hand. What do? You leave the moment. You dive into your future and you start to make plans about what you will do, forgetting what I think is the most important element of things, the person opposite you. The script will exist. The person opposite you is a quicksilver set of changes that you're responsible for responding to. So for me, to my taste for acting, the best acting happens in the present moment, not in some concept of a character journey.
How would you describe the difference between your approach to repetition and a lot of other Meisner teachers out there? I know that a lot of other Meisner teachers will, in the repetition exercise, will have actors comment not simply on what the other person is doing, but on what they perceive to be the person's emotional life. What's the difference between what you do and what they do, and why that difference?
So what you're talking about is usually referred to as point of view. The actor must have a point of view. A small story. I'm friends with a guy named Larry Silverberg. Larry has written a series of workbooks on the Meisner Technique that kind of put him at the very top level of the teaching of Meisner. And later in his career, Larry's become more a teacher of teachers of the work than of actors in the work. So he's taught a whole generation of people how to teach Meisner's work. Now, I know Larry because he and I were in the same class at Neighbourhood Playhouse. And so we go way, way, way back. And we had a wonderful opportunity 30 years after Playhouse where we met in a in the same workshop festival in Berlin, and we reunited after all those years. And we sat down in a beer garden and started talking, and almost immediately realized that though we had started in the same room with the same teachers, with the same people around us, getting the same information fed to us, we had come to close but slightly different ideas about the Meisner technique. This is down to things like individual personality, taste, vision for the actor, all that sort of thing. And Larry's a sweet and wonderful man, and a man I admire, an artist I admire enormously. But we do have differences. And he said to me in that beer garden, but what about point of view? So for me saying, I don't like that you're wearing headphones is my point of view. But notice where my attention is when I'm doing that. My attention isn't on you.
It's on yourself.
It's on me and my point of view. It's breaking rule number one, which is you are wearing headphones. Now, my point of view is amply present in my response. To put it into my words keeps me permanently fixed in my head. And keeps me guiding an experience that I'm meant to be responding to. So I find the point of view concept takes on a different color with different teachers.
I love that answer. Could you I wanted to maybe just circle back to what you were saying about the text sits on top. So what is it that the text is sitting on top of? What is that?
Well, if you want, what is that river? If you want to continue that metaphor, you're basically talking about the flow of molecules between the two actors. There's something, I mean, that's my favorite thing about theater. Love film, love streaming, love all that stuff. But in a theater, not only are the actors exchanging molecules, but they're exchanging them with the audience. We're all breathing the same air. And there's some miracle of alchemy that happens in that thing. So I love that. And that flow, that indefinable but utterly present flow of information between us on both the molecular, but also the impulsive, the observing, the responding nature of the way we're interacting keeps that river charged up. And we just let the text bob on top of that wherever it's going to go. We don't play text any more than we play you're wearing headphones. We say those words and they take on the quality of whatever's happening underneath.
In other words, we as actors are allowing the text to conform itself to us and to the moment, rather than us trying to conform ourselves to some idea of how we think the text should be said.
Perfect. And let me ask you a question, Ben, because you're one of the most traveled and trained actors I know. Have you heard? I hear a lot more here living in England than I ever did growing up in America, that the actor's job is to tell the story of the piece, which is actually not factually true. It's not your job to tell the story of the piece. Have you heard that in any place other than England? Is it just an English thing where they say that or the phrase?
Look, I mean, I was speaking with another relatively high-profile American coach recently who didn't quite say it like that, but did say it in a slightly different way. And I think to your point was talking about, from their standpoint, the importance of the actor really understanding the story that they were telling. And I totally take their point. I also take your point that that our job is to be responsible for what is happening right here, right now. And that I guess maybe one way of thinking about the story is, or the story is kind of like the given circumstances, which in a sense create the riverbank that will direct that flow of water in the moment.
Ooh, ooh. Doubling down on metaphor, Ben. That's great.
Yeah.
You got there before I did. That's exactly what I would say, is that I think here in Britain, where there's a kind of a level of modesty that exists in the culture, the idea of you tell the story of it's not your story to tell, it's the play's story, and your job is to be subservient to that event. I don't see it as that. I do think, however, the given circumstances modify what we do. We behave differently in a meadow or the sporting arena than we do in a lift or an elevator. I can't remember what you guys call it. And so our circumstances absolutely modify our responses, but we don't have to think about that. We just have to live in that. We might break those rules. We might shout in that elevator, right? Yeah, we might. But it would also be something that would be happening in the moment because of some necessity that pushed us beyond that limit. So we can't ignore the given set of circumstances. We must accommodate those givens, and that modifies what we do as actors.
So would you say then that what's important is that you simply know as an actor what those given circumstances are? Let that knowing inform you, and then just be in the moment.
Right. So I feel obligated to say that we've now skipped away from repetition and moved into the last stage of our work together. So Meisner would be shaking his head at me now for even address this, because we've jumped around, and he wasn't a big believer in that. But no, it's good. Well, you just entree new, Ben, just between us. What we're talking about here is not just the given sensor, just knowing. It's knowing. And knowing is a huge event in the analysis of text, but it's not as burdensome as actors seem to think it is, right? Just to take a very frivolous example, what did you have for lunch today?
I had avocado on toast and some eggs.
Now I know you're Australian. And you didn't have to carry that burden with you.
No.
When it was needed, the information popped up to the surface and you dealt with it perfectly. This is what actors, I think, don't understand. I watch them stuff information into every orifice in their body like it's this huge lift they've got to have. It's not. It's a condition of existence. And it's so simple and straightforward that, again, the actor runs the risk of getting distracted by their avocado on toast when, in fact, it's just lunch. It's what had happened, and it came up when it was necessary. But you never carried it.
Right. Yeah.
So the relationship to knowledge is very specific in our work.
You just need to know what you need to know in that particular moment. Yeah.
And it starts with a clear analysis of the text, but can be added to by things like the setting under which you're living or what direction you've been given. All those things become part of the given circumstances. Now, let me address this because I want to leap ahead to Meisner's full definition of acting, because now we're on to the second half of the definition. Meisner said that acting is living truthfully under a given set of circumstances. So putting those two concepts side by side. And if you step back from that just a bit and look at that and that definition, it's remarkable. It's so pure. It's so directed. It's so specific. And any actor hearing that and taking it in will go, well, of course. It's inspiring to know that that's their job, right? Not to impose themselves on something, but to go into a circumstance and live truthfully. So one of the key differences, I think, that I watch people who teach Meisner speak of is the idea that Meisner said in his book and on his videos that he's done, was acting is living truthfully under an imaginary set of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And when I left Meisner and started teaching his stuff, I used that phrasing too.
Mm.
And it took me a little while to figure out what was going on, but it's problematic.
Mm.
And what the truth is that when I was studying with Meisner, he used phrases differently. Sometimes he would say that. Sometimes he would say acting is living truthfully under a given set of circumstances. And on occasion, he'd say acting is living truthfully under an imaginary given set of circumstances.
Mm.
The thing that's important to take away from that is that Meisner did not mean the actor's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
He meant that those circumstances are given to the actor, imagined by somebody else, handed to the actor, and the actor goes and lives truthfully inside them.
Mm.
It's not imagined by the actor. It's a given. And when the actor comes to understand the difference between imagining something and living in the given of it, it's an opening up of things, because the imagination takes place right where Meisner didn't want you, and the given is all around you. It surrounds you.
Mm.
And so I never say imaginary set of circumstances because it's confusing to the actor. And Meisner didn't mean your imagination. There's a story in his book, and I'm going to get the details wrong. So
It's okay.
don't, yeah. But it's something along the lines of an actor's doing a scene for him in the classroom, and I know the classroom very well that he's doing it in. And the actor walks over to the windows in the classroom and looks out the window. And Meisner stops the scene and says, "What do you see?" And the actor looks out and says, "Oh, I can see the Alps, and I can, there's a skier and some snows gently." And Meisner gets up and goes over to the window, and he looks out the window, he turns back to the guy, and he says, "I see bricks." He didn't want the actor to disappear into an imaginative world. And even though he and Stella were good friends and I think admired one another enormously, they very definitely differed on that point of view.
I guess that comes back to another key concept in Meisner, as we've spoken about before, which is that acting begins in the reality of doing. Could you maybe speak to that? Because it's something I absolutely fundamentally agree with, and think that there's a huge trap that often I see actors fall into, which is when they think that acting is simply about pretending. What for you does that mean, that acting begins in the reality of doing?
I have memory of sitting in Neighbourhood Playhouse, and within the first day or two of arriving there, and it was a hot day, and the windows were open, and everybody was on edge, And the exercise that was introduced to us was that we sit and listen for a period of time. So we all kind of put on our listening face and listen. Traffic, I don't know if you can hear the traffic outside my window, but we would hear traffic and horns beeping and the sounds of the street and people breathing around you and listening to everything that goes on. Then they stopped that exercise and asked what we heard, right? And began a conversation with us about, were you acting?
Mm.
Was that acting when you were doing it? And to a person, no, well, I wasn't acting. I was listening. I wasn't acting. And Meisner says, well, that's the beginning of acting. Not listening, but investing in the reality of doing. Actually listening meant that you looked like you were listening to anybody in the room. And so suddenly we begin to see that he doesn't mean for acting to be a presented event. He needs it to be embodied, engaged. And the actor listens and looks like they're listening is better than the actor who communicates the idea of listening. So the investment in the reality of doing changes everything about our thinking about acting. You're really doing something. You're not pretending or communicating the idea of that.
To act literally means to do something, not to pretend something.
There you are. There you are.
What had you moved to London, and what had you begin the Impulse Company?
It was 1996. The story starts a little bit before that. I had been running a theater in San Francisco area, and it was the best job. Somebody put a keys of a theater building into my hand when I was 29 years old and said, fill it.
Wow.
And God, that was my dream job, and I loved it. The theater, lucky for me, had been in kind of a low mode, so anything I did basically helped. And I did that for 7 years, and I loved it. Then I began to realize that this wasn't going to be the end of my career, that as much as I loved it and as hard as I was working at it, I didn't see my career ending at that place. And I began to think about, if not here, where? And if not now, when?
Mm-hmm.
And so after 7 years of doing that, I made the call to say, I'm going to move. I'm going to open up, because San Francisco at that time was a massive marketplace of theater, but it was, with no disrespect to that space, it wasn't necessarily where I wanted to end up.
Mm.
So I began to think about where. Well, I could move to LA, which wasn't really my vibe, and nor was it where I saw myself working at the highest points that I wanted to work. I could move to New York, and the issue there would be there's a lot of people in New York who have my skill set and my information, my knowledge. I could move to Paris. Well, I'd love to, but don't speak the language. And then I thought, well, I love London, and it is my idea of a theater town. And maybe I'll try that and see what happens. So in January of 96, I moved here, thinking maybe I'll get 6 months out of it. Maybe it'll be longer than that. I don't know. And very quickly met people and began to establish things here, just because I found my happy place.
Mm.
My home is in Drury Lane. I'm sitting in Drury Lane now, right in the heart of theater. Well, that's a metaphor for my life.
How wonderful.
Mm.
How have you found that meshing of this very American approach to acting, based in Meisner and the method? How have you found that has gelled with the British approach to theatre, the more classically trained approach?
It's a great I'm going to struggle to make this a short answer. I'll try. I think, first of all, the classical British training that you're alluding to was largely gone by the time I got here 28 years ago. Mm-hmm. It existed in people's memory, that sort of you speak the lines clearly and don't bump into the furniture mode of working. And it still exists to some degree. But for example, at that time, RADA, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, the head of acting there was a woman named Doreen Cannon, who was an Uta Hagen disciple, and who had been teaching for possibly as long as 10 years. I don't know Doreen's story exactly, but she had been teaching there for many years, the Hagen approaches. So there had been inroads here in Britain of these wild American ways of acting. And if you think about it, Ben, the collection of training in the mid-20th century in New York City, the names associated with that have not been equaled since. Right? The Strasberg, Stella Adlers, the Meisners, the Kazans, on and on and on. These names. It was a time of foment and a time of great thrilling, aggressive energy in that direction. And here, I dare say, things have become a little bit codified. So, or a little bit without the same kind of energy flowing around the notion of teaching. Perhaps that's too critical. I'll have to think about that. But immodestly, I'm going to say I got lucky and arrived on these shores at a moment when I now look back and realize there was an opening for something. So I started meeting people when I got here and, introducing myself at parties and doing all that, networking that some people love and some people don't. And I met a guy in my rounds who is a great man in every way you can define great, not the least of which he's a great actor named Julian Glover. And as I was sort of trying to find how I was going to work here, I was realizing nobody knew Meisner. Nobody had been teaching Meisner at all. There had been some wafts of it a few years back, but nothing really going on. And I met Julian at a party, and we hit it off and became friends. And a little while later, I was doing some research, and I found out about this place called the Actors Center, which was a support place for the professional actor. Remarkable space. And I noticed that Julian was on the advisory board for the Actors Center. So I made the hardest phone call I've ever had to make in my life. And I said, Julian, you don't know me well enough, but would you be willing to front me in to the Actors Center? Dear boy. And he called me back in 45 minutes, not to be all Olivier on your ass, but he called me back in 45 minutes and said, you have an appointment with Ian 2 days from now. Ian was the head of programming there. So I go in and I meet with Ian. And at that time, I couldn't work here legally, except in the limited circumstances where I was providing a skill a Brit could not provide. So the only thing I could do, I couldn't work at a pub, I couldn't do anything. I could work teaching Meisner. So I laid that out for him. And Ian got this faraway look in his eye and he said, now that's really interesting because just yesterday, somebody was saying to me, I've been hearing about this thing called the Meisner Technique. Why don't you see if you can find somebody to do a workshop in Meisner Technique? Next day, I'm sitting in his office saying I can do a workshop in the Meisner Technique. So I began working there, started with a 2-day class in July of '96. And that's how I got started here. At that time, nobody was teaching Meisner here. Now, there isn't a major institution that doesn't offer some form of this technique. And watching that grow over time has been very gratifying.
That's amazing. And since you began Impulse back in '96, it's certainly grown enormously, and you offer training for actors that want to come and study with you for how long is the course? It's a year, is that correct?
Yeah. It's the training basically reduces down to 5 exercises, and we teach that over a year's training. We don't pretend to offer anything else. We don't do voice. We don't do. We focus on what we do well and appropriately. So our 5 exercises, it takes a year to get there, and then we provide opportunities for one to work after that. We have a very successful class. In fact, I just did the last day of a class we call Play in a Month, where we work on 4 successive Sundays. We work on a single play using our techniques. People are cast in a role, and at the end of the 4th Sunday, we put on what we call not a performance. The idea being to take result orientation out of the event and just see where our techniques can take us. We did an Australian play yesterday that rocked me. It's called Rapture by Joanna Murray. And these actors blew it apart and just gorgeously played out. 6 actors, script in hand, technique of at the fore of reading and responding, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house at the end of it. It was quite astonishing.
How extraordinary! How did you come to end up initially traveling to Australia and teaching out here, and as well as starting an Impulse company out here?
So that is all down to one person, the gorgeous Kate Skinner, who was a student of mine here and came into her. I remember meeting Kate in a large drop-in class that I was teaching at the Actors Center. I'm going to guess around 2005, give or take. And I remember her sitting 2 people down from me on my right with her arms folded, both metaphorically and physically. He was not sure about this shit I was shoveling. And I remember clocking her not concern, that's not the right word, her skepticism. And something happened that night that sparked something in her, and she came and did the year at the Impulse Company and became an absolute acolyte for the work and a brilliant teacher of the work. And she manifests it in her work as an actor. Now she's in something right now, and I bet she's terrific. I'm looking forward to seeing her in it. So Kate, due to circumstances, moved back to Australia. She's an Australia Sydney sider, and she said, I can't just leave this work. Why don't we see about you coming over and doing some teaching? And so I came over for, I believe, a week. And Kate and I just put together a class, and we made that happen. And one thing has led to another. Kate then joined up with another person another Aussie who studied with me here, went back to Melbourne, and they together run this growing firm called Impulse Company Australia. And so that happened. Now it's moved to Tokyo. We're going to Hong Kong.
Incredible.
Paris. It's just, drop a pebble in a pond, right?
So lots of opportunity for people to study with you all over the world, which is amazing. I thought I'd ask another acting related question, which is about how you deal with the problem of emotion in acting. I know that there's often a lot of questions or concern that actors have about this need to portray emotion or to get emotional. And I wanted to hear from you about what repetition and what Meisner offers in terms of dealing with this issue.
So my head is going in 2 different directions, and I have to decide which path I'm going to take. I could have called my company the Emotion Company, and that would have been a cool sounding word, cool sounding title. I didn't. And the reason I didn't is that I think emotion as a concept is hard for an actor to trust. Actors don't trust being emotional. Any actor in the world knows that sense memory works better some moments than others.
Yeah.
And they learn that they live in terror of the day it's not going to work. I think if you substitute the word impulse for emotion, you do 2 things. You take that fear off the back of the actor, and you bring them into the present moment. Impulses produce feelings, and impulses and feelings sit side by side. But the concept of emotion tends, it seems to me, to put a heavy blanket on top of that idea. I would much rather talk to an actor about impulse than talk to them about emotion. That said, yesterday I watched something happen in the Not a Performance that an actor did, Justine Smith, and she was playing one of the roles, and she came to a moment in the play where she had a sudden realization. None of us knew before that moment that the character was having that revelation. And her revelation was that her marriage was no longer working for her. And I watched the actor clock the moment, discover it right in front of my eyes, well up with tears, and spend the next, she has a long speech at the end of the play, sobbing because of what she was losing in this knowledge. It was devastating. And it didn't happen because she planned to be emotional. It happened because she made a discovery in the moment. So the last little story is the great Liv Ullmann, great actor, wrote a book many years ago called Changing, which I was 17 years old and I read because I was nutty about reading anything I could find about the profession. And she was rehearsing in Stockholm as Nora in a dollhouse under the direction of the great Ingmar Bergman. And she came home and she wrote in her diary, which became changing, this sentence: "I was surprised to discover that Nora would cry at that moment in the play." When I read that as a 17-year-old, my head exploded, because I thought, well, that's acting of an order I never see. The idea that you discover that rather than decide has informed everything I've done since. Emotion follows the moment.
Emotion follows the moment. What is the difference between an actor playing and trusting their impulses versus when they're playing an idea of how something should go?
The actor feels the difference, right? Because they're not connected to anything around them as deeply as they are connected to the idea in their head, right? And every actor in the world knows the frustration of, I've got an idea, but you're not feeding my idea. And the rage that accompanies that is a little bit out of kilter, because the problem is not that the other actor isn't feeding them, but that they've already decided something that may not prove organic in the moment. So the whole notion of making discoveries rather than deliveries is at the heart of what I teach. That and what you discover is that feelings are massive in those things when you let go of ideas. Here's the other thing the other distinction I would make between the effective memory approach and what we do. And we certainly believe in a state of what we call a state of aliveness. But the difference is that the method actor, to my eye, has an unconscious tendency to arrange moments in a line.
Yep.
And to say, this will lead me to this, which will lead me to that, and then I get my money shot there, right? And the actor who does that does it at a sacrifice of living in the moment, because they're living in their plan for the moment. So the method, so-called because when Brando burst onto that screen in a torn T-shirt, a whole generation of actors said, that's new, that's different, I want to do that. And they named it the method. Was useful, terribly useful in its day for shaking loose in our profession all the codified sort of performative notions that, the don't bump into the furniture notion that had existed before that. So it was terribly necessary. But I'm with Mamet, who in True and False, which he published in, I think, 96, give or take, said that the method is no longer necessary to deliver the acting that we want. It was at one time, but now we don't need it anymore. And I tend to agree with him. I don't go to the place he goes after that, but I agree with that notion. And Mamet's also a Meisner guy too.
He is. Yeah.
Meisner adjacent. Yeah. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, Ben.
No, I think that absolutely is. How would you suggest to an actor? I think I might have asked you this question once in class, but I think I really liked your answer, so I thought I might ask it again now. How can an actor trust, when they are on stage, the difference between whether what they're thinking or of doing in the moment is an impulse, or it's an idea that they had, or like, this would be a cool thing to do right now?
I love the question. I have no idea what my answer was before. Do you know what it was?
I do. Yeah. Look, I think you said the moment that you begin to question it and not simply act on it is the moment you turn the impulse into an idea.
There you go. That's beautifully said. One of the big things about you teach, so you know this to be true. the message is not the message I send. The message is what is received. And so you just said it better than I could have ever said.
Well, I'm just quoting you.
Oh, okay.
What suggestions do you have in terms of other work that actors could be doing outside of repetition? Is there work that you would advise actors do when they're on their own, for example?
We were talking about this yesterday. You more than anybody I know, or as much as anybody I know, Ben, will know the fact that the actor's job is quite specifically different now than it was when I was studying with Meisner. At that time, for example, the idea of an actor being prepared would include the expectation, and this was more spoken of than dealt with in reality, but the actor was expected to have 4 monologues in their back pocket ready at all times: a classic drama, classic comedy, contemporary drama, contemporary comedy. And you always changed over your monologues just in case you needed to keep fresh and not do the monologue somebody just did or whatever. And that was when auditions were handled in a very different way than they're handled now. That is, you're almost never asked to deliver a monologue unless it's from the piece itself that you're working from. But at that time, there was a kind of homework an actor was thought to have had. How many of us did that? Well, that's another story. So the question of the actor being ready to work addresses something that Bill Ball was big on, which is the idea that the actor is a lonely artist. The actor cannot do their work without an awful lot of infrastructure around them in the way we work now. I mean, the actor can act any time, but how does one prepare and stay ready for the moment when, fate calls and the star fell down the staircase and suddenly you're on? How do you stay ready? I think to keep the engine tuned, we at the Impulse Company have a series of drop-ins that we do. That's a tune-up to keep you ready to work. That is a nice equivalency of the dancer at the bar or the pianist playing scales to keep the actor sharp. In terms of working on texts, that sort of thing, for me, there's a slightly limited value to that. It can be very enjoyable, and you can get other actors in the room and do scene study together and all of that. But exactly how much of that is developmental is a question in my mind.
Yeah.
To the actor. It's very difficult, with the greatest respect in the world, it's very difficult for actors to get into a room and progress well together.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of reasons why. And our business is hierarchical for efficiency's sake more than anything else, I would say.
How does your approach with Meisner, what do you think it can offer actors in terms of auditioning and in terms of self-taping, for example?
I confess that I have not got my arms around self-taping. I ask every casting director I know, I talk to actors about their processes. And the thing is, it's so new to the audition process that I don't think anybody can give me an answer just yet. Everybody's grasping for what the answer is on self-tapes. You know this better than I do. You do self-tapes. And I think there are certain things that you have to think about. But the way I believe that auditions always did work, and self-tapes must work now, is that the actor must be focused on not what they need, but on what the auditor needs. Your success in auditioning is directly tied to whether you have met the needs of those people who are looking at it. Right? And the actor, unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons, goes in thinking, if I'm a good enough actor, maybe I got a shot at the role. Well, that's not true.
Right.
Because if you remind the director of his last boyfriend, you haven't got a chance in the world, right? You're not getting that job, and you beat yourself up because of that. But what you don't know is it had nothing to do with you, right? And so the actor, I think, has to become a kind of detective, or what do they want?
Mm.
They make their best work in that direction, knowing that they may get it wrong, but that they have to be meeting the need of the auditor in order to have a shot at the job. The other thing they must do, and this is always high risk, is they must be memorable.
Mm.
They must be. You've had the experience. I'm sure, a million times where you've sat in a waiting room to go into an audition, and you've looked around and you suddenly realized, oh my God, everybody in here looks exactly like me. How am I going to just make myself different from these people? How am I going to be memorable? And so those two things, find out what they need and try and meet it, and in some way or another be memorable, have nothing to do with my work. Absolutely nothing, but everything to do with getting the job. So the great irony of our profession, and it's painful, and I don't like saying this, is that though our business does more job interviews than any other business I can think of per capita, we do it worse than any other industry. And the reason we do it worse is the skills that you are asked to demonstrate in your auditions bear almost no relationship to what you will do in your job.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
And I hate that is so. But it is our reality, so you got to get through it somehow or another.
Well, look, I mean, I would argue too, though, that your training, the kind of work that you're doing, that does have actors really be in the moment. There is something so exciting about watching a performance that is that authentic and grounded, and it feels like this is actually happening now for the first time, rather than something that feels all hashed out and pre-planned. You can feel that difference between when a performance feels alive and when it feels like it's being reheated, so to speak.
Definitely. 100% true. Absolutely. And also, your ability trained into you to connect, to listen, to respond to what you're given is very sexy.
Mm.
People like it. They like to be listened to. And if you can do it, you leap over a lot of good stuff to get to the heart of what it is. That said, so my brother's a commercials director in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And he watches sizzle reels and show reels and submissions all the time, and he spends seconds on each.
Yeah.
Not minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Because either you're going to be right for the role or you're not. Or as I sometimes say, you're either right for the role and you're in the running, you're not right for the role and you're not in the running, or you're not right for the role, but they see something that makes them think twice. Yeah.
Love that. I agree with that construct 100%. But the problem is, how do you teach it?
Right. Is there any kind of similarity or correlation that you see between repetition and the kind of work that you do and improvisation? Because there is a sort of a spontaneity. Obviously, in improvisation, the onus is on the actor to come up with the given circumstances as they're going. But what is the sort of the similarity between repetition and improv?
Less than you would expect, I think. There isn't that much similarity. And the reason is very simple. Improvisation has 1,000 iterations to it, and everybody does little improvisatory games. And by the way, Australia is probably the world center of improv nowadays, particularly Melbourne.
I think so.
Oh my God, the scene there is so exciting. And I know of no other place that does improvisation as passionately as I see. It's for me, the equivalent of Chicago in the 1950s. You've got this energy going on around improvisation. And so I have friends in that world, and I admire them enormously, and think that they're very gifted at what they do. I think the large difference is the result that's expected out of improvisation is the crafting of something. And the actor doesn't really have in doing repetition, doesn't have any larger aim. That's why the focal point is the moment. There's nothing overhanging that. And I think when one doesn't matter what iteration of improvisation one does, the actor then has some level of, dare I say, result around this event that repetition doesn't. So the differences, I think, are the difference between sitting down at that piano and working muscles or sitting down at the piano and playing an etude.
Right. I'm going to let you go in just a moment, Scott. I thought one final question I wanted to ask you is, what for you makes for a really electrifying performance? What for you makes good acting? And maybe can you think of some performances that have stood out in your mind that you've seen as examples of that?
I think there's nothing more beautiful than an actor who's prepared to be vulnerable. And as we talked earlier about this, the actor also has to have skin as thick as lead to get the job, but then has to go in and strip all that off and just be vulnerable. Yeah, I mean, take the last shot of a movie called Call Me By Your Name. There's an actor prepared to be vulnerable, and there's almost nothing more beautiful. It's achingly beautiful to watch that. We in our work, we don't say to make things matter. We say let things matter. And that's a whole different notion. And who does it better than Chalamet in that shot? So just to take that one example, there's any number of examples of that. Meryl Streep in the title moment of Sophie's Choice. I've never seen it since the first time I saw it, because it was too gut-wrenching for me to watch it again. There's on and on and on. We could go. I could have been a contender. What is that but an actor being vulnerable? So that to me is a thing of beauty, and making that space would be helped by a Bill Ball approach to saying, here's this safe spot where you get to be vulnerable, and and to be held in that vulnerability. That's our job as teachers, I think, in part, and then give the technique that allows that to happen.
It's interesting that you mentioned Chalamet. I know he's a big fan of Meisner repetition. What is it about repetition that you think taps actors into the vulnerable? There is something very vulnerable about just allowing somebody to see you.
Because nobody knows what's going to happen next. Even the improviser knows they can control what happens next. The repeater doesn't.
So exciting.
So exciting.
And so electrifying.
And we're all in the room, and we all know when that moment's happening, and the actor flies on that moment. That river, sends you off down the way.
Well, Scott, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And for anyone who is interested, first of all, in anything to do with William Ball, you gifted me this book last year, A Sense of Direction, some observations on the art of directing by William Ball. And I have to say, it is so brilliant. Just what William Ball has to say at the beginning of the book about what art is, and digging down into consciousness as that sort of starting point is really extraordinary. And I really thank you for introducing me to his work. I did not know who he was before I met you. And for anyone who is interested in working with Scott, we're hosting Scott in July at Acting Mastery on the 27th, 28th, 29th for a Taste of Impulse, a 3-day workshop, which is a really incredible introduction to the work that Scott does, and I just absolutely loved it. You'll also be running some workshops with Impulse Company while you're in Australia. Do you want to speak to what you'll be offering?
Put me in a room and I start teaching. So until I'm in the room, I don't know what I'm doing. But our website's impulsecompany.org.
Yeah, great, great. Are you doing another play in a month or play in a couple of weeks?
Yeah,
So that's
because of my limited time there, we do a play in a fortnight there,
play in a
and
fortnight.
and I'll be doing that both in Melbourne and in Sydney. So
Amazing.
that is an amazing class. That one really flies.
How exciting. Well, so for anyone who wants more information, they can go to impulsecompany.org or to actingmastery.com.au. Scott, an absolute honor
I
to
love you, man. You stay well. I'll look forward to seeing you very soon.
we'll see you in a few weeks. Thank you so much.
With pleasure.